Well, the Western media, in particular, the Washington Post today, calling these strikes on Ukraine overnight and into this afternoon a turning point in the war. And I couldn't help when I saw that wondering, I couldn't wait to ask you this question, is that a rhetorical device designed to elicit some sort of emotional response, that the tide is turning, the sea is changing now? Are we truly at a turning point? And if so, which way is this thing turning?
I think it's a turning point of sorts, perhaps not quite what the Washington Post is suggesting, which I think may be something else. But let's talk a little bit about this conflict, which has evolved considerably over the last 7 months. Conflicts are not static. War is an ever-changing sea, if you will. And for the last 7 months, even though people in the West will never, ever admit it, the truth is that President Putin has exercised enormous restraint with regard to the use of his military power. We've never seen more than 20% of the Russian ground force in Ukraine. And most of the regular Russian ground force was subsequently withdrawn after the first 4 months, during which the Ukrainian army that we built over several years was largely destroyed. What you have in Ukraine now is a mix of various volunteer organizations, militias, some allied forces like the Chechens, Kuban Cossack volunteer organizations. They've turned out to be very good fighters, plus the Wagner mercenary group. It's also turned out to be very effective on the ground. But the real Russian army, with its combat forces, has largely pulled out of the fight. I thought they would come back in August, but apparently the decision was made not to do that. And what's happened now, I think, in the Kremlin is that Mr. Putin and his advisors have all concluded there's no chance of negotiating an end to this conflict. I think he really clung to that hope, even in the middle of April, when it was clear that we in London would not permit Zelensky and Kyiv to make any sort of a compromise, to accept neutrality, for instance, off the table. So now we're dealing with a different Russia. And what you saw yesterday in 3 waves were 202 missiles and loitering munitions attacking specific targets all over Ukraine. This is something that they've always been able to do. They have the precision-guided munitions and missiles, just as we do. This time, they not only hit so-called critical infrastructure, they also hit the secret police headquarters of the Ukrainian state, which is a notorious organization engaged in murdering people and forcing people into enemy gunfire at gunpoint, recruiting at gunpoint. But they also hit a number of analyst cells, places where people are putting together intelligence pictures. In other words, they've signaled that there's nothing happening in Western Ukraine that Moscow doesn't know about. And they've also signaled there's nothing over there they can't reach and destroy. So I think we're seeing a glimpse of what's going to happen later on this fall, which I predict will be major offensives on the ground once the soil freezes. That's coming. And this will be much closer to what a lot of us thought would happen at the very beginning. Massive offensives designed to utterly annihilate what remains of Ukrainian armed forces.
The Western media is trying to paint these Russian airstrikes, these attacks, as inconsequential. That they're not really hurting Ukraine. I've heard this from a few propaganda mainstream media outlets over the past 24 hours. And I'm just going through the laundry list of targets. I mean, hitting Polish forces that were amassed and ready to invade